All right. Good morning. Oops, let's see. We've had some technical difficulties this morning, but hopefully we've got them all resolved. So if you're joining us online and it seems like we're running a little bit late, it's because we're running a little bit late. But glad to be here this morning. Glad to have you in person with us. And I have my Discovery Center mug. I made myself a cup of tea this morning. And, on Sunday I mentioned the idea of gifts. And the idea, of course, this is Christmas season and we talk about gifts. And gifts don't always have to be expensive, but it's the thought that goes behind them. And so this cup also was a gift. And it has significance to me because of the thoughtfulness of the individual who gave that to me. So, thank you. Exodus chapter 21 is where we'll be this morning. And what we're going to see this morning is, and we're just going to cover one chapter because there's a lot of stuff in here. But what we'll see is there are rules or judgments from God regarding how we deal with one another. Now, the next three chapters really talk about a variety of issues. It's kind of continuing the same theme with different issues. But this morning in chapter 21, we'll be dealing with the issue of what to do with what we would call them indentured servants. And we'll talk about that. You could call them indentured slaves, but that has such politically charged word with it that we want to define that a little bit further. So the law has something to do with, or talks about, what to do with our indentured servants or how to treat them. And then rules concerning violence. What happens when somebody is killed or maimed, and how does God prescribe things? And then laws concerning animals. And so we'll look at those. And then later on in the subsequent chapters, there'll be things regarding theft, or what to do when somebody steals something. What happens when somebody steals or takes a woman's virginity. Idolatry and sorcery. Treatment of disadvantaged people within society. Money and property lending. And then justice and equal standing before the law. So, my goodness, chapter 21, 22, and 23, if we as a culture adopted this as our standard, as much as it might seem sort of almost old-fashioned, but if we took these things and put them into practice today, I think our society would be much better. There would be less of a sense or an idea of people getting away with things. And as we see, as we'll go through this, that there is not partiality based on the standing of somebody. There's not partiality based on whether they're, in this case, a judge versus a peasant, or a king versus a peasant. The law was designed to apply to all. And so, let's pray, and then we'll jump into Exodus chapter 21 this morning. Father, I thank you for your word. And Lord, I thank you more than anything else that it is relevant today as it was relevant at the time that it was written. And Father, would you help us to understand it? And Lord, may we as a culture, may we as individuals apply these sort of standards with one another. In Jesus' name, amen. So again, remember in context, we just had what we call the 10 Commandments given to us in chapter 20, outlining how we're to treat one another, how we're to treat one another's property, and most importantly, how we're to respond to our God. And now what we see in the next few chapters, but this chapter specifically, is now sort of the details of how do we deal with one another. So verse 1 of chapter 21. Now these things are the judgments which you shall set before them. So judgments or rules or regulations. These are the regulations according to God that we're to set before the people. In context, Moses was the recipient of this, and he is supposed to set this before the people. Okay, here's the rules, how we conduct ourselves. These different regulations or judgments are really remarkable because it brings about justice for humanity. And it doesn't prejudge somebody, again, based on their skin color or their class, their position, their money. Now, of course, we understand in practice, people always bring that in. In practice, well, you're my family member, so I'll let it slide. Or in practice, you helped me out in the past, so I'll give you extra, sort of leeway in this way or that way. But that's the frailty of our human hearts and minds. God's intention was that there would be remarkable justice and prudence, and the law equally applied to all. So that was God's plan, God's intention. Of course, this does show our tendency, our vulnerability in the sense of our human life and the necessity for things to be laid out because we have a fallen nature that tends to look after my own and have a higher standard or judgment against somebody that's not part of my group, whatever my group happens to be. And the idea is these are wide-ranging over the next 3 chapters, wide-ranging, pretty much touching on every area of life and how we deal with one another. So again, this morning, it'll be dealing with our servants, and in our modern vernacular, we could really think about that in the sense of employees and employers, how you deal with one another. And then how we deal when there's violence between individuals and how that is to be dealt with. And then, again, how we deal with animals, how we treat animals. And so, first and foremost, there is no room for what we would term today animal cruelty. Now, in this time period, they didn't have dogs and cats like we have today that were pets. What they had was farm animals, livestock that was considered part of your possessions, and what to do in one particular case, what to do if your ox goes off and hurts somebody. Are you responsible for that? And we'll give us some guidelines for that. So these are general rules or rules that were to be applied to everybody. Verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew servant. Now the word servant could also be slave. And now there's some different context here that we need to understand. Slavery or servant, not excusing it, but understand it in the context in what Moses was dealing with. So, sometimes falsely people blame the Bible for slavery. Let's just be honest with this. Slavery existed before Moses ever was around. Matter of fact, the Israelites were what in Egypt? They themselves were slaves in Egypt. Now, they had voluntarily come into the land. They were welcome into the land under, Joseph. Get the names right. But then the feelings or the king changed, and now he put on a different set of requirements on the Hebrews or the Israelites. So slavery always existed. And matter of fact, biblical individuals are the ones that abolished the slave trade. Now, let's be clear on this. Does slavery exist today? Yes, it does. It is the depravity of the heart of man. But the Bible is responsible for eliminating or negating slavery. It is biblical men and women who were born again by the grace of God who fought tooth and nail to eliminate or abolish the slave trade between Africa and West India. It was because of Christians that what we call the abolition of slavery happened here. Are we excusing the inhumanity of mankind to one another? No, we are not. But we can't blame the Bible for the heart of men when the Bible talks about the heart of men. But what we're talking about here in verse 2 here is not slavery in the sense that we think about it and in the grossest sense of it, in the sense of somebody devaluing somebody using them as property and then treating them extremely poorly, and then getting away with it or having it endorsed by the culture of the time that Moses was writing of and the institutions that they had. We would call this more about indentured servants. And an indentured servant or indentured slave was somebody who worked for you for a season for a specific purpose. This is not somebody who was a lifelong slave, but this was somebody who worked for a season. So notice here in verse 2, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall be put out free and pay nothing. So there's a term limit on slavery or on the servant, that it was not a lifelong. Now, how it was practiced in the Americas, in the what we call the Caribbean, or at the time called the West Indies, how it's been practiced in other parts of the world, was literally until you died, you were a slave. This is not the biblical context that we find here. In Hebrews, or excuse me, here for the Hebrew slave, it was the idea that they served for a season. In other words, a person might enter in. Now notice, this is the idea of somebody, when you purchase a Hebrew slave, the idea is that they willingly engaged in this. And there might be several reasons why somebody would willingly engage in this. Somebody is extremely poor, and they might sell their liberty to pay off debts or to pay somebody else, or maybe in some instances, they literally cannot provide for themselves. And so they become an indentured servant. Later on, if they chose to, they could become what we call a bondservant, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So extreme poverty might lead somebody to become an indentured servant. In other words, they're selling their own liberty. But there's also requirements that the slave would be, or the servant would be the servant would be treated well. A father might sell his daughter as a servant into a home with the intention that she would eventually marry into the family. Now, if you recall, there was a dowry system. And if you were the father of a daughter and you wanted her to be married, you had to pay money for this dowry. And the idea that if you came from a family that didn't have the resources, you could, in essence, sell the service of your daughter to this family instead of paying the dowry, and then with the intention that she would marry into this family. In the case of bankruptcy, a man might become a servant in order to pay off his creditors. And then in a fourth case, if a thief had nothing, they were stealing literally because they had nothing, and they couldn't pay the proper restitution, they could serve to pay off their debt. Notice in each of these arrangements, it was chosen, it was mutually arranged, it was of limited duration, and the servant was to be highly regarded. They were not a piece of meat, they were not an animal. Contrary to how slavery in many institutions, in many countries, ended up being lived out, but God's standard was that the slave or the servant would be treated well. Notice that they were to serve for a limited duration, 6 years. In the 7th year, they would be set free and they would owe nothing. So the servant was not obligated to live a lifetime of slavery. Again, the servant was to be treated well, was to be provided for. Contrary to how slavery, especially in this century, ended up being lived out. If you're not familiar with it, African tribes would capture other Africans and then sell them to usually change hands many times, but sell the enemies of their tribe to somebody else, eventually into what we would call slave traders, who would then treat them like cattle, worse than cattle, go across what was called the Middle Passage, which was from West Africa to the West Indies normally, and then also into America. And then they would be slaves. They would be treated like cattle, oftentimes worse than cattle, especially in the Caribbean, the West Indies, where it was a sugar plantations. They were engaged in a very dangerous work and work that oftentimes shortened the life of the individual. And then from the West Indies, especially for regards England, the sugar would be brought back to England as a profit. And they did similar things here in America and, unfortunately, in other parts of the world as well. The distinction between what we're talking about here in Exodus 21 and what we have seen exhibited in mankind is the way that mankind treated it. You were less than an animal and treated as such. Matter of fact, the laws of that time allowed you to treat this person as if they were a piece of property. Whereas the Bible is quite clear, they are not a piece of property. They are a human being, and you need to treat them with dignity. When somebody was captured and sold into slavery, it was a lifelong thing. But biblically, it was 6 years of service. So they were bound. So it would be more appropriate for us in a biblical context to really call them servants because, again, they were indentured. Their payment was their labor to pay off a debt or something else. And so notice this, verse 3, if he comes in by himself, he must go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. So here's the idea, that if I was sold as an indentured servant, whatever I gained while I was in my master's employ remained my master's. But if I came in with a wife and kids, those kids were mine and they were set free. But if I married while I was an indentured servant, my wife still belonged to my master, and then therefore there'd need to be arrangements to pay for her. And I could certainly redeem her or buy her out of her indentured servanthood. If his master has given him a wife, verse 4, and she's borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall not go out by himself. Or he shall go out by himself, So I can't take my wife and my kids with me, but I would have to redeem or pay or make an arrangement for my wife and my children to be set free. But if the servant plainly says in verse 5, I love my master, my wife, and my children, and I will not go out free. Here's the case. Notice this is an act of free will. I've married, I have children, I love my family. I don't have the resources to buy their freedom, and so I choose to remain a servant for you in what we would call a bondservant. The servant plainly says, verse 6, then his master shall bring him to the judges. This was a public thing. This was not some dark room, shady deal. This was a very public thing, and that I could declare, and the idea is going before the judges is that the master and the servant would both publicly declare in sort of a courtroom scene, I choose to do this, and I do this of my own free will. Again, this was not somebody's arm being twisted. This is not the idea that somebody had no other choice. This is the idea that they were committed to their master, no longer motivated by debt or obligation, but simply because of love and the good treatment that they received under their master's care. You may recall or think back to Abraham as an example. He was a wealthy man in his time, and he had many servants. But if those servants were treated well, they might choose to remain a servant under Abraham and have a better life. In our modern vernacular today, it's really our employment. We choose, or we should have the freedom of choice to be able to say, I choose to work for such and such a company. And I like the way the company treats me, so I'm going to continue working here. Now, if you don't like the way the company is treating you, you have the freedom to move to a different company. And that's the basic idea. So the idea of being brought before the judges was would be a courtroom type of setting where the servant could plainly say, and the master could plainly say, we do this, we enter into this agreement willingly. So the masters bring him before the judges. She shall also bring him to the door, and at the doorpost his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. This is the term bondservant that we get. Notice this. In Psalm 40, verse 6, we're told this: sacrifice and offering you did not desire. My ears you've opened. Now, I originally thought of this, the first time I ever read that verse, I just thought it meant God gave me understanding. But perhaps it is much more the idea that God doesn't require of us sacrifice and offerings, but instead what he wants is us to be his bondservants of love. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, Paul delineates and says that Jesus was a bondservant to his Father. Paul himself calls himself a bondservant multiple times throughout the New Testament or throughout the epistles. We could look at this awe being pierced through the servant's ear as the same as the nail being pierced in the hands and the feet of Jesus. It's out of an act of genuine love and willingness. Christ doesn't require any of us to follow him. Now, he does lay out consequences. If you follow me, you have eternal life, and I will be with you, and I will guide you in this life. If you reject me, you have eternal death, hell, damnation, and you don't have my guidance. But it's your choice. You still have a choice. You still have a freedom of choice. Even if you choose the wrong, you're still free to choose. Which is one of the dichotomies or the difficulties of this relationship with God. We sometimes ask, why is there evil in this world? Well, there's evil in this world because God gave us a choice. We can choose to be evil. We can choose to do despicable things to others. That's not God's fault. It's because he gave us a choice. But he does want us to respond to him in love. We have the freedom to choose to follow Jesus all the days of our life. We have the power within ourselves to say yes to Jesus or to say no to him. It's totally up to us. Yes, we will suffer the consequences, but it's still our freedom. It's much like many things in life. There are consequences for our actions, both good and bad. If you choose not to go to work, the consequences are you don't get paid. Now, you might not like that idea, but that's the natural consequences. And so consequences for our actions, both good and positive, are not bad. Moving on to verse 7, again dealing with the idea of servants. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slave does. So the female daughter isn't released after 6 years. But notice this. This always refers to the idea of not so much being sold as a slave, but sold in preparation or with the intention of marriage. So again, think of Abraham and his large family, and you come alongside and you say, well, gee, I don't have much resources, and would you take in my daughter with the idea that she's going to marry one of your other servants? Or maybe you're a large family. Hey, again, marriages were arranged. I know kids don't like that idea, but I think most parents would like to have arranged marriages so they can dictate what their kids do or don't do. But the idea was you would arrange this marriage, and you would say, okay, my daughter, maybe she's 10, and marrying age isn't for another 4 or 6 years. And unfortunately, they did marry really young. But you'd say, okay, look, she'll serve you, and Joe and Sally are eventually going to get married, but until that time, she's going to live in your household, serve in your household, and when the marriage is ready and prepared, then she'll be married to your son, and then she'll be free. Or she could be married to another servant. So this was not her being sold as a slave, as in the sense of Cinderella, and she gets to do all the dirty work. This was to be a part of the family. But notice this. If she does not please, verse 8, does not please her master who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed, in other words, purchased out of that servitude, and he shall have no right to sell her to her foreign people, since he's dealt deceitfully with her. So again, the idea was, we're going to arrange a marriage. But if some reason it doesn't like out, the boy doesn't like her, the family doesn't like her, then the one who had purchased her or allowed her to be her servant was to allow her to be redeemed or to be purchased out of her servitude. He could not go and sell her to somebody else. He couldn't say, well, you know what, we don't like her, she's not working out for us, and so we're going to just sell her to somebody else. That was prohibited. So she was allowed to be redeemed, or again, purchased out of her servitude. Now notice, the terms of the marriage needed to be fulfilled. If they agreed to a marriage, and part of that marriage was this girl serving as a servant for a number of years, if somehow they failed to fulfill their contract, it was a breach of contract. And again, the girl would be set free, having paid whatever needed to be redeemed. But then notice this. Verse 9, if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the customs of daughters. Notice this girl, as she's entered into this betrothal period, even as a female slave or servant, she was to be treated as equal with the daughters. She, again, was not the Cinderella. She wasn't a second-class citizen. She was a part of the family. She was to be given the same sort of food or subsistence that others had. She was to be given the same sort of quarters or housing. Again, how slavery worked itself out in the West Indies and in America. Slaves were not given the same quality of food or the same amount of food as the masters. They were housed in sub-housing compared to their masters. And this is not the biblical instructions. This was not what God had intended. Okay? Verse 10, if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food. So again, sometimes the custom that they have, unfortunately, multiple wives, but if he didn't like her or married another woman, that didn't mean that he got to treat this girl with less. In other words, again, she wasn't a Cinderella, that she got equal portion of food, provisions. Do not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. You can't say, no, this woman can't be married because she came into my household as a servant. She had equal rights as if she was the daughter in this family. And if he does not do these things, 3 for her, then she shall go out free without paying any money. So in other words, if she got mistreated at home, in other words, she got fed once a day and everyone else got fed 3 times a day, then she could say, wait a minute, you didn't treat me fairly, and now I'm released from this servitude. So what we see here is this idea of treating others with dignity and respect. A far cry from how we saw slavery lived out in practice, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, slavery's been around forever, and slavery still is happening today. And the common denominator, unfortunately, is that we mistreat individuals. That slave is no longer considered a person, it's considered a piece of property. And that was never God's intention or God's Notice from the very beginning, God created us man and woman, and we have equal standing before God, irregardless of our class or ethnicity or skin color. We are all valuable before God. And it's the depravity of man that justifies our mistreatment of others, for whatever the cause might be. Now, in the next section, he's going to deal with when we mistreat others in a physical sense. So verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. Capital punishment. I know capital punishment is a political issue today, but here's the idea. If you intentionally, now there's a differentiation here in this text between murder and manslaughter. Murder is the premeditation. I decided I'm going to take your life, perhaps because you have something I want, or I'm motivated by anger, but it's a premeditation. I'm going to take somebody's life. Whereas manslaughter is more of, I accidentally did something, or maybe the heat of the moment, I did something that caused somebody's death, and that's considered separately or differently than murder. But notice this, all the way from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 9, we see that whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For the image of God he is made. So each of us, whether we are a servant, a slave, a woman, a man, we are valuable and made in the image of God. And notice the requirement is that if somebody murders somebody else, it's up to the rest of the community to do the capital punishment. Not quickly, not the railroaded, we discover that somebody's dead, and so we just pick the first guy we can find, and by noon we have him hanging from a tree. That's not the idea. That's a perversion of justice. But the idea, it was to be used sparingly because people, out of fear of capital punishment, would slow down before they just simply killed somebody for the sake of their car or the sake of something else. Texas is not a perfect example, but having worked in the prison ministry some, there was a general idea that if you messed up, if you did something wrong, if you're from another state, you didn't want to get caught in Texas because they were more serious about their punishment in Texas. Much rather get caught somewhere else, like in New Mexico, where they're more lenient. But Texas had this reputation of being more of a stickler and following through with the laws. You may be familiar in the state of California. Capital punishment is legal again. It was first legal, then it became illegal, and now it's legal again. But the state of California has not, in 40 years, put anybody to death. So there's not a fear of being put to death. Whereas in the state of Texas, I don't know what the number is so far this year, but every year we put multiple people to death. Now, I'm not saying that we railroad somebody, not saying that we don't give proper opportunity for a rebuttal, an accurate defense. But there ought to be a fear in our culture that says, I don't want to step over the line and murder somebody because that means I will be put to death. Now notice this. However, if he does not lie in wait, verse 13, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. This is the manslaughter idea, and what we see is the cities of refuge. This is the idea that if I accidentally caused somebody's death, I was able to flee to a place. And when I went to that place, then the heat of the moment could settle down, and then we could have what we would call today a trial to find out the evidence to see if so-and-so had actually killed this person or not. But, verse 14, if the man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, then you shall take him from the altar that he may die. So even though a person pleads for God's mercy, and the idea of going to the altar was certainly the place of sacrifice, but at the corners of the altar were these horns, little portions that would come up. And the idea was that somebody could go to the altar, cling to the horns of the altar, and ask for God's mercy. But if you had done it premeditatively, then there was no recourse to plead to God to have mercy on you. It's different if, for example, your brakes failed on your car and you crashed into other people and you survived, but you killed somebody in this accident. Well, that's manslaughter. And that you could plead for God's mercy. But if instead you said, well, let me cut this guy's brake lines because I don't like him, because he gave me an evil eye or whatever else it might be, and you intentionally killed this person, then no matter how much you pleaded for God's mercy, you still suffered capital punishment. Now, in the New Testament sense, even if somebody's guilty of premeditated murder, they could still call out for God, and God would be gracious and merciful to forgive them of their sin, and they would still enter into eternal life, but their life might be ended prematurely here through capital punishment. So again, God makes a big distinction here between what we would call manslaughter and premeditation or murder. Verse 15, and if he strikes his father and his mother, shall surely be put to death. This is targeted primarily towards older children who may be in anger or maybe wanting mom or dad's inheritance, and they strike them, causing their death. The child doesn't get away with it just because, well, mom and dad are old and feeble. This is contrary to some ungodly thinking that's floating around our culture. That is, at a certain age, we should no longer extend medical care or care for individuals. Right now, the idea is floating around that once somebody reaches 75 years of age, we shouldn't extend any extraordinary medical aid to them, that they're taking up too much space. You know what? We could solve some of our issues in assisted living facilities as soon as somebody reached 75 if we just euthanize them. It would make care a lot easier. But that's unbiblical. It's contrary to what the Bible says. And so again, there was instructions, if you struck your mother or father and causing them death, then you were guilty of this premeditation, this murder. Verse 16, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. Now, the basic premise of what we consider slavery was the idea of kidnapping somebody else for the purpose of selling them to somebody else. And what was the penalty for that? Capital punishment. You see, the Bible is quite clear. It's one thing for you to sell yourself into indentured servanthood. In other words, to say, look, I don't have the money to pay my debts. I don't have the money to pay for my food. And so I sell myself, my labor, but you have to treat me as a human being, but I sell my labor to you for the purpose of providing for myself, versus somebody that kidnaps me and then sells me. So, and again, in practice, even today, with the slavery that exists today, most people are kidnapped against their will, forced into slavery, and that is worthy of capital punishment. Again, just giving you a little history in the Western world in the 1700s, 1800s, where the slave trade was rampant, what happened was other Africans would kidnap other Africans, probably because they were of a tribe that they had a war with, and then sell them to others that eventually they ended up in the West Indies or the American colonies as slaves. And that is clearly unbiblical from even Exodus chapter 21, not even counting other things. So in verse 17, he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now, the cursing here is more the idea of I wish you were dead, as opposed to I think you're a stupid mom. Okay, so it's more of that idea. Verse 18, but notice the respect that the younger generation was to have towards their older or their parents. In other words, just because you're young and strong doesn't give you an excuse to mistreat the elderly. And isn't that something that our culture today needs to hear? If men contend with one another, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed. So here's the idea. You get into a fight, but you injure the other person where they end up being bedridden. And if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. But he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him until he is thoroughly healed. So the idea is two guys get into a fight and hurts the other guy where he's bedridden. The victor has to pay for the time that the guy lost plus his medical expenses. But it was limited to that. Okay, you lost 3 days' wages. I compensate you for that. Your medical bills were this much. I compensate you for that. And that was the end of it. None of this, what we see today of punitive damages. You know, the stories that go around is somebody who ordered a cup of hot coffee from someplace and spilled it on themselves because the lid wasn't securely on. Well, certainly you can ask for the process. If you lost work or if there was medical bills, you can ask for that, but not the bazillion dollars that today we pass out to people because somebody didn't take responsibility for themselves. It's not like winning the lottery, okay? Or somebody gets into a car accident. Yes, is it appropriate to pay for the damages to the car, pay for any medical bills that you might suffer? But no, you shouldn't have a bazillion dollars of sort of damages awarded way and beyond that, okay? But if the man, verse 20, beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hands, he shall surely be punished. Notice the male and female servant was individuals, the same requirement of killing somebody else. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished for his property. So on one hand, you can't beat somebody to death. On the other hand, if you strike somebody in a sort of a disciplinary way, that was okay. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm happens, he shall surely be punished accordingly, as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So in other words, again, the idea that the unborn child and the woman are valuable, and there is a punishment. Verse 23, but if any harm follows, then he shall give a life for a life. So in other words, if this fight, the consequence of this fight is the woman either dies herself or the child dies, then there's a life for a life. Notice again, life is valuable before the Lord. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Here's the idea. Notice the punishment or the revenge was limited to what actually happened, not I'm really mad at you, that I want to take more. And that was, again, in our current culture, that's a problem. That's a problem where somebody thinks because they got into a car accident, this is essentially their lottery ticket to sort of milk the system. Again, that deals with the heart of man. But notice again, this retribution or this recompense was limited. Our tendency in our culture today is to ask for more from the offending party than the damages that we had received. In other words, if I'm driving a 1980 Oldsmobile and I get into a car wreck and now the Oldsmobile is not drivable anymore, that doesn't mean I get a brand new Cadillac in its place, okay? The idea is that you would provide compensation based on the actual loss. So that's the idea here. Again, the idea of the eye for an eye is not to be vindictive, but if you caused harm for somebody else, then you had to pay for that harm. Verse 26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. So if I mistreat a servant, my indentured servant, I mistreat them to the point where they lose an eye, then they're set free. So the idea is there is a financial incentive for me not to mistreat my servant. Again, the idea is, let's say I owe a bunch of money to the bank. I sell myself to be a servant for 6 years to pay off my $10,000 debt, but a year from now, you poke me in the eye and I lose my eye, I'm set free, and yet the master, the owner, was still obligated to pay off that $10,000 debt. So not only did the law require us to treat human beings with dignity and respect, but if I caused the harm of somebody else, then I was required to set that servant free. And if he knocks out, verse 27, knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of that tooth. So if I got angry at my servant because they burnt my toast and I punched them in the mouth and they lost a tooth, well, that bit of anger caused me to set that servant free, even no matter what I had paid to have that person serve me for that 6 years. And so again, there's a financial incentive, but then also we're called to treat one another as human beings. And the same sort of ideas roll down into animals. Verse 28, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. So if the ox causes the death of somebody else, the owner is not responsible for that, but I suffer the loss of the ox, and I can't even eat it. So, it's one thing to say, okay, well, let's kill the bull. It caused all this damage, but at least I get some steaks out of it. In this case, it's a total loss. However, if the ox tended to thrust its horns in times past, verse 29, and has been made known by its owner, but has not been kept it confined so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also put to death. Now the owner is responsible when I know that that ox has a tendency to behave this way. So, in our modern vernacular, we have dogs that sometimes attack human beings. If the owner has no legitimate idea, no reason to believe that that animal is dangerous, the animal is put down, but the owner isn't held responsible. But if the owner knows the animal is dangerous, knows that the animal tends to escape, and I haven't taken proper precautions to keep the animal confined, then not only is the animal put down, but now I'm responsible for whatever damages the animal caused. Wouldn't that change things dramatically in our culture today? I love dogs, by the way, and I think most of the time dogs are not bad. It's the human beings that have mistreated or not treated or confined their dogs appropriately. That's just my little aside. Verse 30, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life, whatever is imposed on him. So in other words, if my ox escaped, it caused somebody else's death, but if the family's willing to settle for payment, I could do that. So there's a mechanism out of the death penalty for the sake of my animal. Verse 31, whether it was gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment it shall be done. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So the value of the life of the servant here is dictated at 30 shekels. Does that number ring a bell to anybody? how much money did Judas Iscariot get paid for betraying Jesus Christ? Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. He was sold at the value of a slave or servant. If a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make it good and shall give money to their owner, but the dead animal shall be his. Now, pits were a common thing in that day. They would sometimes, not oftentimes, use them for storing water because the ground tended to suck them up. But it was used oftentimes for storing grain. Instead of having a pile of grain, you might dig a hole in the ground and put your grain in it to save it, to kind of like a barn. Oftentimes, pits were used as mechanisms to capture animals, especially larger animals. You've all seen the movies or the cartoons where you dig a pit and you put some leaves or branches across it, and the bear comes along and it falls into the pit, and then now you've got the bear captured, and then you can do with it as you want. But if I do that, but a man falls into it and causes harm, then I'm responsible. I have to pay for that damage. Even if my ox wanders into your pit and has fallen and is damaged or killed, the pit owner is responsible. It's the same idea. Again, our justice system, as infallible as it is based on these sort of principles. Individual property, but also responsibility for what I did. So if my pit, or a more modern thing is if I don't know, a windstorm is coming up and my lawn furniture blows into my neighbor's house and knocks out the window, guess who's responsible? It's my lawn furniture, so I have liability for that. Now, the liability laws with insurance are a little bit different, but that's the basic idea. If I caused something, in other words, if I went out in the country to your farm and you said, you can come on my farm and do this and that, but just be sure to close the gate, and I failed to close the gate and your animal escaped and got ran over by a truck, guess who's responsible for that? Me, the person that didn't close the gate. The idea is responsibility for our actions. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then he shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox, and they shall also divide it. So if my ox causes the death of your ox, we sell both of them. We sell the carcass of the dead one, and we sell the live one, and we both split the money. The idea, again, of individual responsibility for my animals and for the action of my animals. Verse 36, or if it is known that the ox tended to thrust in times past, and its owner has not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. So if I know that my ox tends to escape, or that my ox has had this tendency to gore other oxes, and I don't confine it, again, I'm responsible. And I have to pay my neighbor for the damage or the dead ox. Here's the idea. It's quite simple. We're responsible for our actions. If I premeditatively kill somebody else, I'm responsible for that. And the appropriate response is capital punishment. It is required by God that a murderer be put to death. You cannot allow a murderer. Now, we're defining a murderer as somebody who premeditatively kills somebody else. That's murder. You want your neighbor's house, and you decide to kill your neighbor so you can have their house. You want your neighbor's stuff, and you decide to kill them. Or you're just vengeful because your neighbor did something. And even though you're legitimately wronged, there's no excuse for killing or murdering your neighbor. And if you do that, it was supposed to be a very rare case. And that's why capital punishment. But capital punishment was not on the individual, it was on the government or on the judges of that time. Later on, we'll see cities of refuge set up. And the idea there is that if I had committed manslaughter, I got into a fight with your brother, your sister, and they died in this argument, that I could flee to the city of refuge. And as long as I stayed in the city of refuge, the family couldn't go and take revenge. And then I could plead my case. And the idea is I could plead my case before the judges. You know, we had this argument, and he tripped over the rock, and he fell down, and he died. That's what really happened. Versus, you know, I set him up and pushed him over the edge of the cliff or whatever else. In one case, manslaughter, a person would continue to live as long as they lived in that city of refuge. The culture of that time demanded that the families take revenge. So you were obligated, if I had killed your brother or sister, you were obligated, duty-bound, to take revenge for that death. But if I pleaded manslaughter, I had to flee to the city of refuge, and then there I would be kept safe and I would be allowed to plead my case. But if I had committed murder, premeditated murder, even if I made it to the city of refuge, and even if I clung to the horns of the altar and said, I ask for mercy, still capital punishment would be executed upon me. The idea that we would treat one another well, even though they may be in our culture today, be our servant or our employee. If you have a company or you are in the position of supervising others, you are to treat them with dignity and respect. Yes, you may give them the job of cleaning out the trash, but you have to still treat them with dignity and respect, even if they are your trash cleaner-outer. There is no room in the Bible for us to mistreat other individuals. Again, indentured servants is the category that we're dealing with this morning. And the idea is that people would willingly put themselves into this position of being a servant for a period of time to pay off essentially a debt. And if you enjoyed working with that master and he treated you well and you didn't have other opportunities, you could make it a lifetime commitment by becoming a bondservant. Again, with the ear up against the doorpost and an awe driven through it. But notice this. This was not a private ceremony where later on you could have an argument about whether somebody did it voluntarily or not. This is a public ceremony brought before the judges where everybody got to lay out their case. Yes, I like working for Mr. X. He's treated me well. Besides, I've got a wife and kids under Mr. X, and I want to stay with my family, and so I want to continue to be his servant for a lifetime. And that was perfectly fine. Matter of fact, throughout the Bible, we have examples. Abraham sent one of his servants to go get a wife for Isaac. He was a lifetime servant, it appears. Because he certainly had the free, if he was a servant and he was sent off on this long journey, he certainly had the opportunity to say, oh, I'm out of here. Forget you, I'm not coming back. So there was a commitment and a trust that went back and forth between the two of them. And so we certainly see that. And of course, Jesus Christ is related to as our bondservant. And we are, more appropriately said, Paul said, I'm a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Drawing right here from this, I want to serve Jesus for all of my life because I've been bought, I've been set free, and because of the great love that God has displayed towards me, I love him back and I want to do nothing else. And I hope that's your attitude towards your relationship with God. I hope it is not, I just need to get rid of the guilt that I feel because I did this wrong, but that you're really thinking of it as a lifelong experience. I will follow Jesus all the days of my life. Not out of fear of punishment, but because of this great love that I have for God. And as 1 John tells us, because he first loved us. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your tremendous love displayed for us. And that by that love, you've made us your bondservants, individuals that willingly serve you and live for you, Father. Father, may we take the standards that we find here in Exodus and then apply it to our culture and our lives today, that we would treat others with dignity and respect, that we would fulfill our obligations. For Father, you value life greatly, and there's no excuse for taking somebody else's life. There's no excuse for treating somebody poorly, either because of their class or their ethnicity, but may we treat each individual as a precious life that you have created. Father, whether it's at work where we have boss and employee relationships, may we treat one another with dignity and respect. Father, may children treat their parents with dignity and respect. Father, may we not consider the elderly as throwaway people, but as precious people until the day you take them home. And Father, may we not jump to conclusions, but may we give time for evidence to be brought forth, especially in cases of capital murder and such. Father, may we give time for the system to work and time for all the facts to come out. And Father, I pray that you would improve our justice system, that truth and justice would reign. But Father, in our own individual hearts, would you protect us from jumping to conclusions one way or the other? In Jesus' precious name, amen. God bless you. Thank you for joining us this morning.